Eighth grade. Today is Monday, 3:30. Uh, we're going to do the notes for the United States becomes a world power. It starts off with William McKinley becoming president of the United States with Theodore Roosevelt's help. And in exchange, Theodore Roosevelt wants him to appoint him to be Secretary of the Navy. Some newspapers called Roosevelt patriotic. Others were afraid he wanted to get us into war. Now that the West was settled, the United States was far more industrial and agricultural leader. So they decided to align themselves or ally themselves with expansionisms. Expansionism is growing or expanding. Um, People wanted to extend the nation's power to the Western Hemisphere and around the world. In 1867, Secretary of State William Seward did began this with purchasing of Alaska from Russia. They purchased it for a little bit of nothing, and people thought it was kind of a bad move, except their natural resources were phenomenal. And then in the meantime, they also secured the rights to Midway Islands, which are located in the Pacific Ocean between California and Asia. The Midway Islands were annexed by the United States in 1867. Some Americans objected to expansionism because they said that it was contrary to American values. They warned that such takeovers would cause revolutions abroad at other countries. But we next went for Hawaii. We had commerce that drove us to Hawaii. The interest in the climate and the terrain. A Boston merchant established a sugar plantation in Hawaii, and pretty soon sugar and pineapple plantations were all over the island that were American owned. Planters brought laborers in from China and Japan to work on in the fields, and Hawaiians agreed in 1887 to let the United States open a naval base at Pearl Harbor in Oahu. With the help of the United States Marines in 1893, the sugar planters actually forced the Queen of Hawaii to give up her throne, and they took control. In 1898, under President McKinley, the United States did annex Hawaii. Next came Puerto Rico and Cuba, those islands. They were both owned by Spain, and we virtually wanted to have control of those islands, and to support those ambitions, we enforced the Monroe Doctrine. In 1895, Cubans had tried to win their independence many times from Spain, and as sympathies grew for the Cubans, Americans were willing to go to war for Cuba. The president sent a USS Maine battleship down to Cuba. About 3 weeks after it arrived, it blew up, killing 260 U.S. sailors. No one ever knew if it was an accident, if it was a bomb, if it was a mine, but many Americans blamed Spain. So McKinley asked Congress to declare war. Congress quickly agreed, and in April 1898, they voted to go to war with Spain, and we started the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt resigned his post as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at this point, and he, along with some powerful, wealthy men and some seasoned ranch hands, made a group called the Rough Riders. And the Rough Riders, along with African American troops from several regiments, helped to have the Spanish surrender. It only took about 4 months, so it was a short-lived war. But under the terms of the peace treaty between the United States and Spain, Cuba gained its independence from Spain, and Puerto Rico became under United States rule. Then we had the Philippines, which the Philippine people are Filipinos. Philippines was Spain's major military base in the Pacific. The Philippines have tried to get rid of Spain many a times, and Admiral Dewey of the United States, after 5 days after the United States declared war against Spain, he headed to the Philippines on his Navy battleship, and the Filipinos believed that the Americans were coming to help them gain their independence. In a treaty that was negotiated after the surrender, the United States bought the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. So we didn't give them the independence that they so much wanted. Congress voted to annex the Philippines in 1899, and some Americans actually protested that it kind of violated the United States ideals. But expansionism has won again, and the United States did not grant the Philippines independence until 1946. Next came the Panama and the Panama Canal. President McKinley won the 1900 election with Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt, which he was also known as the vice president. But a year into his presidency, McKinley was shot and killed by an assassin, so Roosevelt became president. In his first speech, he talked about building a canal to join the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. In building this huge undertaking, the conditions that the workers faced were horrible. They said that they had to bathe and wash clothes and drink from the same water and cook with the same water. And about 3/4 of all American workers that had started the project got out. So most of the workers then came from the West Indies. A lot of them were getting yellow fever and malaria because of the mosquitoes that were carrying these deadly diseases. But they drained the ditches, they spread oil on the swamps, they made screen doors and windows, and within 2 years they had pretty much taken care of most of the diseases. Roosevelt once wrote, "I have always been fond of the West African proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far." He believed in working patiently to achieve goals overseas, but by using force if necessary. His strong approach became known as the big stick policy. By the time the 51-mile-long canal opened in 1914, Roosevelt was out of office, and he pretty much said, "I took the canal zone." Congress apologized to Colombia and gave it $25 million in 1921. But in 2000, in the year 2000, the United States returned the zone to Panama. The outbreak of World War I, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo actually caused World War I to begin. The United States did not get in at that time. Austria, Hungary, and Germany headed the Central Powers, and France, Russia, and Great Britain led the Allied powers. Eventually, the United States ends up joining the Allied powers. But by the time they got in, Russia had gotten out. Like most Americans, Woodrow Wilson wanted to stay out of the war. He wanted to be impartial. Trench warfare was new for the next 3 years. They built parallel lines of trenches. The men ate, slept, fought, and died in the miserable trenches. They had infested with lice and rats and disease. They were disgusting. Some new weapons. The Germans had invented poison gas. The machine guns that could fire hundreds of bullets a minute. They also tried to stop the flow of supplies coming and going. And so the Germans started using U-boats, which are submarines. On May 7th, 1915, 6 days after leaving New York, the Lusitania neared the coast of Ireland, and it was torpedoed. It was virtually sunk. It killed 1,198 people, including 128 Americans, at which time we still did not choose a side but to fight with, but we actually started giving the Allied countries $3.2 billion and Central Powers only $1 million. So we had definitely chosen a side. After the sinking of the Lusitania, Wilson decided that he needed to start preparing for war back home. So he had all the Army and Navy, everything started getting ready to go to war just in case. But he won re-election under the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Then came the Zimmerman Note. February 1917, somebody from Britain had found a note that had been written by a German foreign minister to one of their German counterparts in Mexico, asking if Mexico would declare war on the United States. They could reclaim the lost territory in New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. The Zimmerman Note created a sensation, and virtually it allows us and makes us know that we need to go to war. The United States entered the war on April 2nd, 1917. Wilson spoke to Congress asking them to declare war, and on April 6th, 1917, they did unanimously. But they also authorized a national draft. Soon 3 million men had been drafted, and another 2 million had volunteered. Um, Overseas, they had heard all about the trench warfare, and General John Pershing decided that that was not the best way to go about winning this war. So Russia had dropped out of the war, and by the summer of 1918, more than 1 million Americans went over to Europe. Um, Pershing set an Allied offensive. He took advantage of new technologies, um, airplanes that could deliver machine gun fire and drop bombs. Tanks could advance through the trenches and actually could not be harmed. Um, uh, he did a huge number of final series battles known as the 100 Days Offensive. It weakened the Germans back all the way to their own border. To avoid the invasion of their own country, German leaders agreed to an armistice, which an armistice is a ceasefire. On November 11th, 1918, for the first time in 4 years, the guns were silenced. The cost of the war was horrific, and more than 9 million soldiers had died, about 116,000 Americans. Propaganda, or the use of selling the war to the public by films, posters, books, was used. The Americans responded by showing their support for war. Families saved tin cans, paper, and old toothpaste tubes for recycling into war materials. Women met in homes or churches to knit blankets and socks for soldiers, and many people joined the local Red Cross chapters where they could roll bandages and package supplies going over to Europe. They raised money for the war by taxes and war bonds. They organized industry for the war. They turned factories into producing less consumer goods and more war supplies. Efforts to conserve fuel and food. They actually had meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, so no meat on Monday, no breads on Wednesday. They made victory gardens in their backyards and in public parks. Then to conserve fuel, they had heatless Mondays and gasless Sundays. They walked instead of driving their cars. The government introduced daylight savings time during World War I because that extra hour of daylight at day's end, households then used less electricity for lighting, so that helped them with money. Fear of espionage or spying led to the Espionage Act in 1917. It made it a crime to try to interfere with the military draft, and it made it severe penalties for spying. In 1918, Congress further cracked down on opposition by enacting the Sedition Act. It made it a crime to say anything disloyal about the government. Hundreds of people were arrested for offenses such as criticizing the military draft or wartime taxes. President Wilson made the 14 points proposal for world peace. His first 5 points aimed for preventing conflict. Nations were asked to avoid secret treaties, to practice free trade, and to reduce their weapon supplies. He asked the new borders be drawn based on self-determination. Points 6 through 13 described new boundaries for many European countries, and his 14th point called for nations to join a general association. It would be a League of Nations, which today is it's United Nations. It actually began in World War II. Wilson was ahead of the game. However, um, after years of fighting and in him trying to get people to sign off on it, the United States wouldn't sign up and would not become part of the League of Nations. The Treaty of Versailles was the treaty that was signed for the end of World War I. German representatives were not allowed to speak. This reflected the Allies' anger and their determination to punish Germany and to remove the future threat. But what they realized later was it's what actually created the threat for World War II. It forced Germany to disband almost all of its armed forces. It gave up all of its colonies and surrendered the territory in Europe. They called on Germany to pay back reparations or money that they did not have for all damages and war debts and war deaths. The amount of the reparations was later set at $33 billion. President Wilson was opposed to the harsh treatment of Germany. However, he needed his 14 points plan to be passed, so he went along with it. He undertook an intense speaking tour, 22 days, toured 29 cities, spoke up to 4 times a day with hardly any rest, and then he collapsed with severe headaches and had a massive stroke. He recovered slowly, but the Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles. The United States was heading towards a policy of isolationism. So instead of expansionism and militarism, now they're back to isolationism. In Germany, the Treaty of Versailles left a bitter legacy. Germans, especially Adolf Hitler, who was a corporal who had been temporarily blinded by gas during the war, felt betrayed by the treaty. Hitler's rise to power in the 1930s would pose a fresh challenge to their isolationism, and only after a second world war would the United States take on the role of world power that it now continues to fill today. I hope this kind of helps you to wrap up the chapter. Make sure you do the game by tomorrow at 3 o'clock, and I'll see you soon. Bye.